All right, Isaiah chapter 7. Let's read the whole chapter together. This is one of the few times we're actually picking up with the chapter immediately following the chapter we covered last Sunday, because I think our next Sunday is chapter 22, so we're skipping ahead. But today we're in chapter 7. Let's read. In the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Ramaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. When the house of David was told, Syria is in league with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. And the Lord said to Isaiah, go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field, and say to him, be careful, be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands at the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the son of Ramaliah. Because Syria, with Ephraim and the son of Ramaliah, has devised evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son of Tebal as king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, and it shall not come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Ramaliah. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. And he said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey, when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. In that day, the Lord will whistle for the fly that is at the end of the streams of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they will all come and settle in the steep ravines and in the clefts of the rocks, and on all the thorn bushes and on all the pastures. In that day, the Lord will shave with a razor that is hired beyond the river, with the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the feet, and it will sweep away the beard also. In that day, a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep, and because of the abundance of milk that they give, he will eat curds. For everyone who is left in the land will eat curds and honey. In that day, every place where there used to be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver will become briars and thorns. With bow and arrows, a man will come there, for all the land will be briars and thorns. And as for all the hills that used to be hoed with a hoe, you will not come there for fear of briars and thorns, but they will become a place where cattle are let loose and where sheep tread. The first couple verses of this chapter, what's the scenario we're dealing with here?
Israel and Syria have come together to attack Judah.
Yeah, Israel and Syria have come to attack Judah, which if we don't understand Jewish history, then that's going to sound really confusing, because we go, wait, aren't Israel and Judah, aren't they supposed to be one nation? What's going on here? But as we've already talked about, right, there's the kingdom is divided. It was divided right after Solomon. and his son Rehoboam and Jeroboam had some conflict. Jeroboam wasn't his son. Rehoboam was, and he had conflict with Jeroboam. Jeroboam took the 10 northern tribes of Israel. Rehoboam had the 2 southern tribes of Judah, and they existed that way for a long time. You have these 2 lines of kings on either side, and they didn't get along very well, to where we can have Israel allying with Syria, which that doesn't sound like a good thing to do, right? Doesn't sound like a good buddy to ally with. But we have Israel coming up to besiege Jerusalem and Judah. We have some characters here. Ahaz, the son of Jotham, he is the king of Judah, the son of Uzziah. Pekah, the son of Ramaliah, is king of the northern kingdom. And Pekah was a usurper king. If you go read about him in the Chronicles, or actually 1 Kings, I think 15. I think it's 1 Kings 15. If you read about Pekah, he was a usurper. He was the son of the king's captain. So the king was Pekahiah, and that he had his captain, and the captain's son was Pekah, and Pekah made a conspiracy and killed Pekahiah and ascended to the throne in Israel. The northern kingdom, if you read the history through the Kings and the Chronicles, it was extremely turbulent. There was all this political intrigue of backstabbing captains and all this kind of stuff. It wasn't abnormal. So there were actually several dynasties in the northern kingdom. It wasn't one family line dynasty. It was one that was broken up by these different usurper kings, and then they would have their kids and grandkids sit on the throne, and then someone else would come in and usurp authority again. So the northern kingdom was really politically turbulent. The southern kingdom, Judah, was far from a godly kingdom. But some of the kings were godly, and some of them weren't. But by and large, they weren't consistently godly, but the dynasty was much more stable, and it was the actual Davidic line. So here we have Ahaz, who stands in the line of David in the southern kingdom, and Pekah, the usurper king of Israel, and he is allied with Rezin, the king of Syria. We got to pay attention because there's a difference between Syria and Assyria. And even when I started preparing for this, I was a little bit confused. Like, wait, how is this happening? And, oh yeah, they're different. They're different things. Syria and Assyria are different kingdoms. And if you don't pay attention to that, then it doesn't really make sense. So Rezin is the king of Syria, allied with Pekah, the king of Judah. Israel. Thank you. So the king of Judah is Ahaz, son of Jotham. Jotham, Ahaz's dad, was a godly king. We read about that in the Kings. Jotham's dad was Uzziah, who was also a godly king. And you'll remember from the last chapter that Isaiah began his ministry in the year that King Uzziah died. That's when he saw the Lord high and lifted up and received the commission to preach. So Uzziah was a good king. Jotham was a good king. Ahaz was a wicked king. He was idolatrous, and he even went so far as to sacrifice his sons. And following the story that we read about here, he even plunged into worse idolatry. So Ahaz is not a good guy, but he's in the Davidic line, and that is going to be important here. If you read 1 Kings 15 and 16 and 2 Chronicles 28, you can get some background to this story too. And if you want to dig into that, we'll touch on a few verses in those chapters in a little bit. So here's Ahaz. He's besieged. And it says that his heart and the heart of his people shook as trees of the forest shake before the wind. So he's got this alliance mounted up against him, and it doesn't seem like, from a human perspective, that he can hold him back. that they're going to be overrun by Israel and by Syria. But remember, Ahaz is in the Davidic line, and that means he's heir to the Davidic covenant, which if you believe that if you're the king and you believe the Davidic covenant applies to you, then that would be extremely reassuring in this situation, because you could go, the Lord is on our side and has made promises to us. Go to 1 Kings chapter 2. 1 Kings chapter 2. Would someone read verses 1 through 4? Mm-hmm.
Now the days of David drew near that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and prove yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. 4.
Yes, please.
That the Lord may fulfill his word which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons take heed to their way, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, he said, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel.
Okay, so here Ahaz stands in direct line to this promise. If he walks before the Lord, then the line of David's not going to lack a man to sit on the throne. And if you know the Old Testament at all, God just, in a matter of a verse, will wipe out massive armies for the sake of his people, right? The miraculous is evident when it comes to protecting his people. And so Ahaz could have trusted in what the Lord had revealed to him and gone, God, I got to trust you, even though I'm in this serious situation, even though we're under siege. But he didn't. He's filled with fear. Beginning in verse 3, we have the Lord actually promise to protect him regardless of the fact that he was filled with fear, because the Lord said to Isaiah, go out and meet Ahaz. He was to go out, Isaiah and his son, Shear-Jashub. So God sends his man, his commissioned man. Remember, he was just commissioned in the last chapter to go preach, even though they weren't going to listen and their hearts were going to be hard. He was to go preach. And so here is one of the instances where he's sent out by the Lord. Go talk to Ahaz, take your son, Shear-Jashub. Now, Isaiah's sons, he has more than one. We're going to bump into another one of them in a little bit. They all have fancy names that mean things that are significant. And Shear-Jashub simply means a remnant shall return. A remnant shall return. So we have this foreshadowing. Isaiah is going out to talk to Ahaz, but he has his son, who is a remnant shall return. So we already have this foreshadowing that this might not go very well if there's only a remnant. But at least there's a remnant, right? So in the remnant, remember, there's always this weight of, wow, most people are going to get wiped out. But this hope that God preserves the remnant. And we have this foreshadowing in Shear-Jashub. So they go up at the end of the conduit, the upper pool, on the highway to the washer's field. And here's what Isaiah was commanded to say. Be careful, be quiet, do not fear, do not let your heart be faint, because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands. Smoldering stumps of firebrands. Does that sound, when you describe the mighty armies that are surrounding Jerusalem as smoldering stumps of firebrands, does that make them sound that impressive? God describes these armies as essentially weak. Smoldering stumps. Hey, Ahaz, don't fear. The reality was that Israel had to ally with Syria for a reason. At this point, Israel is not very strong. And the Assyrians are right on their heels and very close to wiping out Israel and Syria anyway. So this is really sort of a desperate effort on Israel and Syria's part to ally against Judah. And they're weak. They're about to be overrun. So God promises Ahaz, it's not going to work. Verse 7, it shall not stand. It shall not stand, it shall not come to pass. And here's how he describes it in poetic terms. He says, the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. So you've got Syria epitomized by their capital, which is Damascus, and epitomized by the king who reigns there, Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people, Ephraim being the northern kingdom. And the northern kingdom is described in poetic terms. The head of Ephraim, that is the nation of Israel, Ephraim being one of the major tribes, is Samaria, the capital city, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah, that'd be Pekah, the king. They're going to be overrun. They're going to get wiped out. So God's promise to Judah is they're not going to stand. They're not going to succeed in their siege. And within 65 years, their nations are going to be overrun. They're going to crumble. They're going to fall. The argument with building the pattern of the nation and the capital and then the king who reigned, essentially, God's just pointing out that they're human nations with a human head, a human leader, and they're not going to succeed in their endeavors. They're just men, human kings of weak nations. The final line is so good because it just makes it clear what this whole discussion is about. Because sometimes we don't understand sometimes Old Testament dialogue is hard to understand what the point is. The final two lines there in Isaiah's comments: if you're not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. So the call to Ahaz is, believe God that these nations are not going to stand. But if you don't believe God, there is no hope whatsoever. If you don't stand in faith, you're not going to stand at all. There's your option. There's your option. If you're not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. The fact is that Ahaz, we're going to go to 2 Kings 16. Ahaz didn't want to trust God in this whole situation. And we don't have the details in Isaiah, but we do in 2 Kings. 2 Kings 16. Ahaz, he wanted to put his hope in an alliance with Assyria. So Israel had allied with Syria and come against Judah. And so Ahaz of Judah goes, I should make an alliance with Assyria to help me out in this situation. So 2 Kings 16, would somebody read 5 through 9?
And then Rezin, king of Syria, and his Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up into Jerusalem to war. And they besieged Ahaz, but could not overcome him. At that time, Rezin, king of Syria, discovered Elath, and Syria, and drave the Jews in Elath from the Syrians, and came to Elath and dwelt there unto this day. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria, and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which rise up against thee. And Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord, and of the treasures of the king's house, and sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria hearkened unto him, for the king of Assyria went against Damascus and took it, and carried the people captive, and slew Rezin.
Okay. So those few verses actually cover a broader period of time than we read about here in Isaiah. But to summarize, Ahaz is besieged, just as we've been reading about here in Isaiah. Ahaz is besieged, so he goes and allies with Assyria, and Assyria helps him out. But we're going to read the end of the results here in Isaiah 7. So we've kind of already seen that Assyria is going to help him out, but back in Isaiah, we still just have Isaiah talking to Ahaz in the middle of the pressure cooker, if you will. So God is going to keep them, or no one will. Be firm in faith, or you won't be firm at all. But Ahaz, he wants to put his hope in a human alliance with this pagan king. He wants to ally with Tiglath-Pileser. So God makes a promise. Just trust me is what he's saying, if we were to boil it down. Just trust me. I'll take care of it. They're not going to stand. And the Lord is even going to offer Ahaz evidence that he will be faithful. Look in verse number 10. God offers Ahaz a sign. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. So Jehovah, he is condescending to Ahaz. He sends his prophet to speak to him and go, hey, you trust God, he's going to take care of it. Ask for a sign. I'll show you that I'm going to come through on my word. Anything. As high as heaven, as deep as Sheol, as deep as hell, whatever you want to ask, I'll show myself to be powerful on your behalf. And a sign that we understand is basically just a miracle to confirm that the Lord is certainly going to come through on his promise to preserve them from Israel and Syria. No limits on what the sign could be.
In other words, he could just ask the Lord, can the sign be destroy the armies?
Yeah. How about you make him go poof? Whatever kind of sign. What's Ahaz's response in verse 12?
He's pretending to be humble, but in actuality he's prideful.
Yeah, he's pretending to be humble. I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. The false humility is, I really don't need to prove the Lord's faithfulness, But if we know the backstory, in addition to what Isaiah is telling him here, the whole time he's putting his trust in Assyria. He's not putting his trust in the Lord. So he puts on this false piety. Oh, I really don't need to prove. God doesn't really need to prove he'll come through. It's all good. I'm sure he'll be fine. But his hope is not in the Lord. So there's this false piety. And it's interesting, the response right away. He said, hear then, O house of David. And those are key words because it reminds us again who he's talking to. The people who are in the stream of the covenant, right? O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Just stop. God he'll come through. It's no big deal. Knock it off. Knock it off with the false piety. It's the same wording as what we read about in 1:14. Let's get back there. A couple weeks ago when we were in chapter 1. Chapter 1, verse 14. And we were talking about Judah as a whole and their false, empty religion. How God was just fed up with their empty sacrifices. And in verse 14, he says, your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They've become a burden to me, and I am weary of bearing them. He was sick of Judah's false worship. He's sick of Ahaz's false piety. You're a burden to your people. You're a burden to God as well. Verse 14. You know what, Ahaz? God, he'll give you a sign. Here's the sign. You don't want a sign? Well, here comes a sign. The Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. If you were to have that verse memorized and not be familiar with the context of where it came from, is this where you would expect it to come from? Isn't this weird? Because we read that and we go, wait, we know what that is. What is he talking about right now? We're just dealing with all these politics of these pagan nations fighting one another and coming up with these alliances with the pagan nations around them, and it's all a mess. And then all of a sudden Isaiah's like, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son and call his name Emmanuel. What? What? God's going to give this sign. He's going to provide this miracle to show his faithfulness and his judgment. And it really is kind of strange. The sign has some very specific marks. A virgin is going to conceive. The word for virgin is, broadly speaking, it means a young woman, but the context informs us whether it's just sort of generally young woman, married or unmarried, or whether it's a young woman who is a virgin. So the context tells us whether or not it is a virgin young woman. And it's interesting because that is sort of the broad definition, but from what I understand, every time the word is used in Scripture and we can actually tell from the context what it's talking about, it ends up actually being a virgin. And then the way that Matthew cites it, which we'll read in a minute, when Matthew cites it in chapter 1 in Greek, it's very specifically a virgin. So this virgin is going to conceive. This is already a abnormal sign. It's clearly miraculous, which is what would make it a sign, right? This virgin will conceive and bear a son. The son's name will be called Emmanuel. What's that mean? God with us. Yep. Or with us God, because the L is the part of the name that is referring to God. God with us, or we are together with God. So he's going to be named Emmanuel. Now, just a side note, any kid could be named Emmanuel. I mean, right? There's lots of kids named Jesus, right? Or Joshua, which is the same as Jesus the Messiah. So it could be anybody named Emmanuel, and it just being anticipating God being with us as opposed to being God himself. So, maybe right here, God's going to provide some other kid named Emmanuel who will be a sign in this immediate context to Ahaz. Just keep that in your brain and think about that. He's going to eat curds and honey. This seems to be symbolic of destruction, because if he's eating sour milk essentially and honey, the symbolism seems to be that there's no more cultivated crops, and that's the way it flows out at the end of the chapter as well, where it talks about the vineyards being overrun with briars and thorns. So there's no cultivated crops. Eating curds and honey, to us that sounds like, is that sort of delicacies? Not sure, but it essentially means he's living off the land. There's not a lot of cultivated crops. So he's eating curds and honey, so the land has been destroyed. And it says that before he knows how to refuse the evil or choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. So there's this promise. Before this sign child has reached an age where he even has sound moral judgment, Syria and Israel are going to be destroyed. So this is coming soon, as soon as the child arrives. Before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. So this child, his age will mark the fall of the alliance that has come against Judah. Flip over to Matthew chapter 1, because Matthew chapter 1 is the reason why our ears perk up when we read this verse, right? Matthew chapter 1, verses 21 through 23. Here, the angel has appeared to Joseph because Joseph is thinking of putting away Mary because she's pregnant. And the angel encourages him, go ahead and take Mary as your wife. Verse 21, she will bear a son, you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. Oh no, I just rest my Bible on my keyboard. Now I have like crazy stuff going on. Okay, here we are.
That's why we always print out our.
Sorry, print the notes. Yeah. So we're familiar with Matthew chapter 1. We're probably more familiar with the words, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call him Emmanuel, because we read it in Matthew more often than we read it in Isaiah. But clearly, Christ fulfilled the passage. That's what Matthew said. This took place to fulfill what was written by Isaiah. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son. His name shall be called Emmanuel. So we go, okay, so this baby's named Emmanuel and he's virgin born. It's talking about Jesus. But then step back and what's the big question? What in the world does this have to do with Ahaz and the siege and when Syria and Israel will fall? How is the birth of Jesus way down the road relevant to this war going on? That's 700. It's over 700 years later. How is that a sign of the fall of Syria and Israel? And so various options are presented. People look at this sign that God is giving Ahaz, and they come up with some ideas on how to bring this all together. Some people say it wasn't fulfilled to Ahaz at all, and it only refers to Jesus. And so we don't really know what it has to do with the timetable for the fall of the kings of Syria and Israel. It's just totally hearkening to Jesus. Some people go, well, no, it must refer to somebody over here. But we can't find anywhere in the context where a virgin has a son and his name is called Emmanuel. There's a person born down in chapter 8, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But there's no one virgin born named Emmanuel. So some people say, well, there was clearly this virgin in the court of Ahaz who, eventually she had relations and produced a son. So she was a virgin when the prophecy was made. And then later she had a son. And then she named her son Emmanuel. And so it's this person born who is prophesied, but the text never actually mentions that it happened. And it's like, okay, so you made it fit, virgin born, Emmanuel, born before Syria and Israel fall, but that's also a person that's not in the text. It's this imaginary person who meets all the qualifications. And then some people think that it refers to Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz, who is born down in verse 3. Problem is, Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz does fit that he was born marking the fall of Syria and Israel, but he was not virgin born. In fact, his mom was married when Isaiah got the prophecy, so she wasn't even a virgin then, and his name is not Emmanuel. So he sort of fits in some ways and doesn't really fit in other ways. Here's my really, really deep explanation. Are you ready for it? I'm not really sure. Jesus fulfills the passage, but he also doesn't completely fill it. Every explanation that I can think of, and it seems like the commentators can think of, leaves something to be desired. So it seems it's not a satisfactory explanation. It doesn't answer all the questions. We can't quite grasp all of it, but it seems that it was partly fulfilled in Jesus because he was virgin born and named Emmanuel, and partly fulfilled in Maher-shalal-hash-baz, even though he wasn't virgin born and named Emmanuel, but his age did mark the fall of the kings of Assyria and Israel. Skip down to chapter 8, verse 3. I went to the prophetess, so Isaiah goes to his wife, and she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-shalal-hash-baz. Maher-shalal-hash-baz means swift to the plunder, speedy to the prey. Essentially, his name means judgment's coming soon. And his age does mark the fall in the same way as it was prophesied. For before the boy knows how to cry, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. So far, we step back again. So far, all that Isaiah has said is, hey, Ahaz, there's going to be this kid born, and it seems like it's referring to Maher-shalal-hash-baz in certain ways. There's going to be this kid born, and before he's very old, Israel and Syria are going to fall. So basically, that's just good news as far as Judah is concerned so far. However, let's keep reading. Back to chapter 7, verse 17. The Lord will bring upon you, and upon your people, and upon your father's house, such days as have not come since the days that Ephraim departed from Judah, the days of the king of Assyria. So, Ahaz, the northern alliance is going to fall, but guess what? The Lord's bringing someone against you. And who's he bringing? The king of Assyria, the same guy that he was trying to ally with, who he thought would preserve him. It looks like human wisdom didn't work out very well, especially when God is the one who is ordering the events, right? There's going to come this time, it's going to be worse for Judah than when the kingdom was first divided. There was a lot of warfare at that time. Assyria is going to destroy Judah, or Israel. Assyria will destroy Judah and Syria, and they're going to seriously trouble Judah. Now, Judah is not going to fall to Assyria because they don't fall to anyone until they fall to Babylon in 586. But Assyria is going to seriously trouble the nation of Judah to the point where if God hadn't preserved the remnant, they would have been totally annihilated. Here's what's going to happen. Verse 18. In that day, the Lord will whistle for the fly that is at the end of the streams of Egypt and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria, and they will all come and settle in the steep ravines and in the clefts of the rocks and on all the thorn bushes and all the pastures. Here's what's going to happen to Judah. God's going to whistle for Assyria and Egypt. They come into the picture too. And they're just going to overrun. They're going to be everywhere. They're going to seriously trouble Judah. Just this week, what's it mean to whistle for Syria and Egypt? It's interesting.
Dog whistle.
Yeah, it's a dog whistle. Just this week, Pa and I, we were tearing down form boards on the shop he's building. And it was pretty early in the morning. And we're tearing down form boards, and I needed an extra hammer, and I couldn't find one. So I headed down the hill to my house to grab a hammer, and halfway down the hill, I heard the whistle. Pa whistled for me, which I would know that whistle anywhere. I've heard it a lot. Right? I would know it out of a whole lineup of whistles. You know, are you sure that's the whistle that you heard? Right? Because I've heard it a lot. Sometimes it means, hey, I'm over here and I found a way through all these bushes we're trying to get through. Okay, I'll head toward the whistle. Sometimes it meant, come quick, I picked up something heavier than I can handle and I'm going to die unless you get here fast. So it can communicate a lot. The other day, all it meant was, hey, I found the hammer. You can come back up the hill. So I did. I turned around and went back up the hill. Luke apparently was still sleeping. Were you still sleeping? Just crawled out of bed. Luke had just crawled out of bed and was still in his house, and he heard the whistle, and he came running out because he knew it meant something too. So he walks out all bleary-eyed, crawling out of bed. Go, why'd you whistle, Pa? Why'd Luke come? Well, because Pa whistled. That's why. So the Lord is going to whistle for Egypt and Assyria. He's going to summon them. This is so important. These are bad circumstances. He is bringing judgment on his people, and he's completely in control of it. God is reigning over these pagan nations, to where he whistles, they do what he wants them to do. And they're going to exercise judgment on Israel and on Judah. They're going to do exactly what God wants them to do. Back up just a little bit to Isaiah chapter 5. What happens when the God of the universe whistles for a mighty empire? They do what he wants. Chapter 5, verse 26. He will raise a signal for nations far away and whistle for them from the ends of the earth. What happens? Behold, quickly, speedily, they come. None is weary, none stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps. Not a waistband is loose, they got their belt on. Not a sandal strap is broken, they got their shoes tied. They are going out to do what God tells them to do. These mighty pagan empires, Assyria and Egypt, they want nothing to do with the true and living God, but when he commands, they do what he wants them to do. Their arrows are sharp, their bows are bent, their horses' hooves seem like flint, their wheels like a whirlwind. Their roaring is like a lion, like young lions. They roar, they growl, seize their prey. They carry it off. None can rescue. So God's going to bring Assyria to wipe out Syria and Israel and trouble Judah. And not incidentally, not accidentally, God is the one who had sent Syria and Israel against Judah in the first place. In 2 Kings 15, it's talking about the days of Pekah, which is the same northern king that we read about here. In those days, the Lord began to send Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, against Judah. God is the one who sent this alliance against Judah, and he's the one who sends the Assyrians against them when they don't trust the Lord. So here comes these nations at the beck and call of the King of the universe, and like a swarm of bees and flies, they take over the land. Chapter 7 again, verse 20. In that day, the same day of judgment that's coming, the Lord will shave with a razor that has hired beyond the river with the king of Assyria the head and the hair of the feet, and will sweep away the beard also. Here's our apologetic for why beards are very biblical. Because in Scripture, getting shaved is often what's being demonstrated is shame. These nations are going to come against them, and they're going to shame them. They're going to humiliate them. You remember there's one story about David sending a bunch of messengers to the Amalekites, I think. I got it written here. I think it was the Amalekites. Ammonites. It was against the Ammonites. David sends his messengers to talk to the Ammonites, and the Ammonites didn't listen to David's messengers, and instead shaved off half their head and half their beard and sent them back. And it was to go, we're going to humiliate you. We're going to embarrass you and send you back. To basically to say, we're not going to listen to David. We're not going to listen to his messengers. Here, have them back half shaved. And David had to actually send his messengers to stay at Jericho until their beards grew back and a war followed. Right? So this shaving is biblical symbolism for just getting humiliated. Jesus' beard was plucked out, right? It was a sign of humiliation. So here Judah is just going to be humiliated at the hands of the Assyrians, which are in the hand of God. And verse 23, in that day, every place where there used to be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver will become briars and thorns. With bow and arrows, a man will come there, for all the land will be briars and thorns. And as for all the hills that used to be hoed with a hoe, you will not come there for fear of briars and thorns, but they will become a place where cattle are let loose and where sheep tread. Just to sum up a little bit, this is sort of a strange chapter, except that it has this super precious verse that we're really familiar with right in the middle. But I think there's some interesting things to glean from it. First of all, God keeps his covenants, right? Ahaz was a barbaric, evil, child-sacrificing king. Just by way of a historical narrative, the Assyrians, just like Isaiah prophesied here, the Assyrians come, squash Judah, or Israel and Syria, squash Israel and Syria. They invade Judah, and Ahaz, being an evil guy, goes, man, if the Assyrians are so powerful, I'm going to worship all their gods. And he sends his people to Syria, to Damascus, to like measure how they have their altars all set up, and to set up a photocopy of it down in Judah so they can go into all this pagan worship that's just like the Assyrians who invaded them because, oh, they're so powerful. We'll worship their gods. All right, he just led them further into idolatry in the midst of their oppression. At the time when he should have been most likely to turn to God because he was under the Assyrian thumb, he just led the people further into idolatry. He was a bad dude. And yet here at the beginning of the chapter, here's God going, hey, I made a promise to preserve the seed of David on the throne. Trust me. I keep my promises. God is a covenant-keeping, promise-keeping God. Another thing we see is that trust in God is a non-negotiable. That was the only place where Ahaz could place his hope. If you weren't to have had Isaiah show up with his prophecy, you would still conclude that, because here we are in the city surrounded. Where are we going to put our hope? If they know anything of God, then that's where they should have immediately turned, even without the prophet showing up. The prophet shows up anyway, and his message is, if you're not firm in faith, you're not going to be firm at all. It's the only option. Trust in the Lord. Thirdly, God preserves his remnant. Because if we were to read this and go, oh man, the Assyrians did invade. It looks like God broke his covenant. No, he didn't. He judged them, but he preserves the remnant. He preserves his people. So God judged Judah, but kept his covenant through it, even though it was a smaller nation that he preserved, or a smaller section of the nation that he preserved. And then God controls the nations. This is really important. If you're going to understand the Old Testament, this is super important, because it's just everywhere. All the events that are going on, all this just back and forth, God's in control of it. Read Daniel, where multiple empires are crumbling during one guy's lifetime, and God's in control of it. Human strength is pretty vain. So it's critical to understand the Old Testament and God's word, but it's critical for life too, right? We still live in a nation of which God is in control, for good or ill, as far as the circumstances that may happen. It's all for his good and glory, but as far as how good or bad things may seem here, it could be good or it could be bad. He's in control of it. And we live in a nation in the midst of other nations over which God he's in control, right? Assyria was the superpower of its day. Egypt was a superpower. And God goes, hey, and they do his thing. They accomplished his bidding. And important for us to keep in mind. Yes?
Weren't the Assyrians also very barbaric, that they put hooks in them and made them come with them?
Yeah. The Assyrians, the Ninevites were Assyrian. The people who Jonah hated because they were so nasty. Yeah, they were not a good people. Yeah. Any other brief comment? We do need to close, but.
I have one comment. Emmanuel is a very common name in Ghana. Only they spell it with an E instead of an I, which is Romanized.
An E at the beginning?
An E at the beginning.
Okay.
It's also interesting that faith in God requires a long view in life. In 65 years even, that they would be destroyed. But they were being attacked now. Or even 9 months. It's a long view.
Yeah.
For those of us who want instantaneous response.
Yeah.
I have one thought too, in verse 21, where it says, and it shall be in that day that a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep. So it shall be from the abundance of milk they give, that he will eat curds. So is that God's mercy also in leaving them with something? He's going to devastate the land, and in his mercy, he's still going to leave.
Right. There's still a handful of people who their living situation is a little more rustic than before. But yeah, they're preserved. Yeah. Good. All right, let's close. Time is a ticking. God, you are real kind to us, and thank you for this chapter. Thanks that in the midst of it, there's this clear prophecy of the coming Messiah, and we see it fulfilled in Jesus as the literal God with us. For Jesus, it wasn't just a name, it was reality. And so we thank you for that prophecy that anticipated him and that was completely fulfilled. Thank you for your covenant faithfulness. Thank you that you are in control of the nation we are in and the nations that are around us. And may we be a people who, in the midst of it, look to you, place our faith and trust in you. And by so doing, glorify you, make a difference in the world in which we live. Bless the gathering of your saints that's about to come in the next hour, and bless those who are at home this morning too, that they would, during this day particularly of the week, have sweet fellowship with you. But also as we all go about our week, may we keep our eyes on Jesus. And in his name I pray, amen.